Thanks for the very nice introduction, Elizabeth, and thank you all for being here and braving the ice to come out. I'm very excited to present some of my work on exclusionary zoning and the politics of housing policy today. I am going to try to talk for about 35-40 minutes, but I welcome interruptions and clarifying questions throughout. If anyone is on Zoom and has interrupting questions, I don't think I can see the chat in front of me. So if there's something urgent, please just blurt out. To give you a little roadmap of where the talk is going today, I am going to start with this observation that may be familiar to many of you, that American cities allow very little multifamily housing to be built. If you, look around, maybe not so much at downtown Chapel Hill, but at a lot of other cities in the region, you'll see that, compared to a lot of peer countries, we have really high rates of single-family home ownership. And this is not purely driven by consumer preference. It's encoded in local law. And these laws have numerous impacts, but one that has really concerned research with policymakers is that these restrictions on low-cost multifamily housing are big drivers of residential segregation and the affordability problems that are becoming increasingly acute in metro areas across the United States. And a lot of the dominant political economy explanations as to why we have these regulations are very race neutral. They point to things like financial self-interest, high rates of home ownership, and NIMBYism. But if you read kind of urban histories and the kind of work that explains why these ordinances emerge that are highly restrictive to multifamily housing, they frequently point to racial origins, to the desire to use these race-blind regulations to preserve and, in some cases, deepen racial segregation. And so I'm going to point out that, like what other facially race-neutral policies that we see in the United States, things like mass incarceration or restrictions on the right to vote, both the origins, the history that kind of led to the implementation of these policies, and the disparate impacts that we see as a result of them being implemented reflect this racial conflict. And to kind of test this hypothesis that the adoption of exclusionary zoning is driven by racial threat among the voters of municipalities, I'm going to collect and code kind of two sets of data. One is zoning maps for central cities across the United States. These are kind of large central business districts at the core of urban areas. And I'm going to pair this with some exogenous measure of Black population growth in the kind of mid-century between 1940 and 1970 due to the Great Migration. And what I find is that Black population growth led cities to zone less residential land for multifamily housing. And I point to a really key mechanism that comes bottom up through voters, that racial backlash and shifts in attitudes towards integration and policies that would promote Black equality have a lot to do with this. So, as I'm sure many of you are familiar with, housing discrimination on the basis of race was not only legal, but ubiquitous in the United States until roughly the mid-20th century. There were a number of policies that reinforced this, but I'll just highlight a couple. One is lending discrimination, explicit racial criteria on who is able to obtain financing from banks to buy homes, including the kind of famous redlining maps drawn by the Sahn Corporation. This is a map of Chicago, and as you can probably guess, the areas in red are the areas that are graded to be the least worthy of giving people loans to buy homes there, as a result, partially due to the racial composition of that population. Another policy were restrictive covenants. These are clauses inserted into the deeds of homes, barring the resale of these homes to not only Black families, but Catholic, Jewish, kind of basically any non-Protestant whites. And there was rampant renting discrimination in similar ways that banks denied loans to Black home buyers. Landlords would deny applicants seeking to rent on the basis of race as well. And while there's some policy action at the state level and through court rulings in the 1950s and 1960s, which start to chip away at this regime of legalized racial discrimination in housing, the kind of big change here is the Fair Housing Act in 1968, which on paper outlaws all forms of housing discrimination. And while this explicit housing discrimination certainly doesn't go away in 1968, it obviously has to take other forms if it's going to survive. And so nearly 50 years after this civil rights legislation, we still see that American cities remain highly segregated. This is a map of the same area of Chicago that we were looking at on the redlining map on the previous slide, showing the kind of four main ethno-racial groups tracked by the census. And you'll see that the divides illustrated by the redlining maps in 1930 are still divisions among racial groups in Chicago today. And to kind of illustrate this, we see that nationwide, the average white residence neighborhood is over 70% white, whereas the average Black residence neighborhood is less than 30% white. And this lack of progress on desegregation is particularly puzzling if we point to consumer preferences for segregation, because we see that liberal cities, places where white residents have the most liberal attitudes towards desegregation, are the places that have seen the least amount of progress. And so I'm going to point to an explanation today as to why large central cities have made so little progress on desegregation. And it's an ostensibly race-blind institutions found in municipal governments across the country. And this is exclusionary zoning. So exclusionary zoning refers to the practice of prohibiting the development of multifamily housing by municipal government statute. It doesn't have to do with excluding a type of person from living there. It's a type of building use. And across the US, nearly every municipality and county has a comprehensive zoning code where every lot in the city has a set of permitted uses and a permitted form. And so I'm going to show you a map of Chicago in 1923, following the adoption of their first comprehensive zoning code. And I'm going to categorize the allowed uses into three types. The areas in gray are non-residential uses. These are kind of industrial, commercial uses. You'll see that they kind of follow rail lines and highways and areas, with lots of factories, stockyards, things like that. The areas in teal are general residential uses. This is where you can have a single family home with a front lawn. You can have a large apartment building. You can have a mom and pop who own a duplex and live in one unit and rent out the other. And the areas in pink, which are a little hard to see here, are areas that are restricted to single family only residential use. These are areas where the only allowable use of land is to have a single family living in one structure. And you'll notice two things. One is that these areas make up a very small percentage of the total residential land area in Chicago in 1923, less than 10%. You also notice they're kind of confined to the periphery of the cities. These are kind of more suburban or in some cases rural areas where these kind of large houses are not out of place. And the map that I'm going to show you here on the right is Chicago in 2016 after the update of their last comprehensive zoning code. And what you'll see is that in the roughly 80 years between this kind of first zoning code and the most recent one, that the growth of single family only restrictive zones has taken over nearly all the residential land of the city. Nearly 80% of residential land in Chicago is restrictive solely to this one use. And while if you just looked at these two maps, you would say this has really nothing to do with race, segregation, and who is able to live where, I will argue today in the talk that not only does this change reflect the intention to racially segregate, but that it also achieved it. And I think part of what this shift helps explain is not only why Chicago and many other cities went from looking like this map here on the left to the one on the right, but also why the United States generally, relative to kind of other peer countries, has these really high rates of single-family zoning, and high rates of residential segregation. So I'm going to shift back to some of the kind of existing explanations for why the United States has these high rates of exclusionary zoning. And first, I'm going to point out that these land use regulations have really disparate racial impacts. They drive residential segregation in places where there's more land set aside for exclusionary or for single-family homes only, and where there's more land use regulation generally, we see higher rates of residential segregation. They drive higher housing costs by restricting the types of housing that can be built, basically not allowing low-cost housing to be built, but also in areas with high demand, putting an artificial constraint on the supply of housing and kind of driving up the costs for everyone bidding on these few units that are available. And overall, it leads to lower mobility and growth across the United States as people are not able to move to high opportunity areas where they would be paid higher wages, but also where the cost of housing has become prohibitive. And despite these kind of disparate racial impacts of exclusionary zoning, a lot of the existing explanations that economists and political scientists have provided for why we see land use regulation are quite race neutral. So there's kind of three sets that I'll highlight today. The first is kind of a classic economic perspective, exemplified by the home voter hypothesis by Bill Fischel, which basically argues that homeowners, property owners, are working as a cartel to kind of safeguard their investment, their large asset, which is their home. And so they are going to act through local politics to prohibit any new developments or any construction that would threaten the value of their home. More generally, we see that this translates not just to homeowners, but to renters as well. Although this kind of financial self-interest is sometimes cross-pressured by other political forces, an ideological commitment to equality or to redistribution, for instance. And this is also exacerbated by NIMBYism, this tendency to oppose something more when it is located nearby than when it is far away. And the small units of decision-making in the United States, where you have the Triangle region with dozens of municipalities, each setting their own zoning code, exacerbates this NIMBYism through institutional design. And in contrast to these kind of race-neutral explanations that focus on financial self-interest, a lot of the historical accounts that look at specific cities and how they changed their zoning codes over the course of the early 20th century really emphasize the centrality of race and exclusionary zoning. And so what I'm going to do is to kind of translate this observation that historians have made to some theories of when race-neutral policies are used to achieve disparate racial impacts. So the first is kind of a classic psychological activation of racial threat. When a nearby group is growing in size or importance, the dominant group is going to react negatively, both in affect and in terms of behaviors towards that group. We've seen throughout American history that there's kind of a what Bachelor Weaver terms a front lash, where people who have been kind of defeated through the policy process work and regroup through other means to achieve the same ends, but through often policies that have little to do with the apparent previous defeat. So we can think of the collapse of the institutions of the Jim Crow South being followed by a rise in mass incarceration. That's kind of the classic example of this. And then finally, we also see that when new venues open up to push policy change, that new actors are kind of brought in to the process. And so I'm going to argue that the post-World War II critical juncture in American cities, where three things happened, kind of set the stage for the high levels of exclusionary zoning that we see in American cities today. The first is that white racial threat is activated by Great Migration. It's the largest internal migration in US history. Over 6 million African Americans leave the kind of rural South for cities in the North, the Midwest, and the West. And whites who live in the city respond in two ways. One is by exiting through the process of white flight, moving to the suburbs. And as I'm going to show today, the people who stay in these cities, their attitudes towards African Americans and policies affecting them become more conservative. The second is a collapse of the regime of de jure segregation that I kind of pointed to in one of the early slides. As legal mechanisms of housing discrimination are outlawed, the proponents of segregation need to regroup and find other policies through which to achieve the same ends. And the opportunity to do so arises through a large growth in municipal planning capacity and the importance of local participatory institutions and bringing the public into the planning process that emerges in the post-war period. And so what I'm going to focus on mostly today is just the first piece of this activation of racial threat. And the hypothesis that I'm going to test specifically is that increasing racial diversity led cities to adopt higher levels of exclusionary zoning, the kind of pink areas in the map of Chicago that I showed initially. And the empirical test that I'm going to set up is to compare levels of exclusionary zoning today, it's measured through zoning maps and codes of large cities in the US, to Black population growth from the Great Migration between 1940 and 1970. And as I kind of previewed, the findings are that cities zone less land for multifamily housing, and that this is specifically driven by racial backlash. So white residents in cities with more migration become more politically conservative and engage in the local political process to demand more exclusionary zoning. So how am I going to measure exclusionary zoning? Well, this is unfortunately a kind of tricky thing to do because, as I mentioned earlier, every city in the United States sets its own zoning code. There's very little kind of overlap in nomenclature or kind of how they go about doing this. And so what I do is I collect spatial zoning data from municipal governments. And here I focus on the kind of centers of commuting zones. So these are kind of the largest cities in an area. So for this area, it would be Raleigh. It's basically kind of the largest cities at the center of metros across the United States. And what I do is I collect two things. One is the zoning code. So this is basically the dictionary that says what the allowed uses and forms are for each zoning district. And I match this to a map. So this is the kind of map of the city that delineates which parcels are assigned to which zones. And so I match spatial polygons to uses for each zone in the municipal code. And I simplify the types of uses to the three colors that I showed you in those maps of Chicago. So these are maps of San Diego, New Haven, Akron, and Worcester. And you will see that I'm showing the gray areas again are non-residential uses. The areas in teal are general residential uses where you can build single family homes or multifamily homes. And the areas in pink are areas that are restricted just for single family only use for exclusionary zone. And the dependent variable that I'm going to be looking at here is simply the share of residential land that allows multifamily homes. So the kind of teal areas as a share of the total teal and pink area. And looking at this descriptively, we see that exclusionary zoning is prevalent even across the big cities in the US. So I find that the median central city in the northern United States allows multifamily housing on only 13% of all residential land. So the map of Chicago that I showed you, Chicago, large American metropolis, millions of people, birthplace of the skyscraper, nearly 80% of the residential land is set aside for single family only homes. And that is actually quite typical of large cities across the United States. And you'll notice that some states are missing here. I'm looking just at states in the North, the Midwest, and the West for a reason that I will explain in the following slide. Okay, so to test this hypothesis that higher levels of higher increases in racial diversity lead cities to adopt more exclusionary zoning, I need to identify an exogenous source of increases in racial diversity, basically increases in Black population growth. And this is very difficult, kind of doing causal inference on this question of increasing diversity is highly confounded by both political and economic characteristics of why people move to certain places. And so to kind of get around these concerns that people are moving to, or specifically Black people are moving to cities because of economic opportunity or because of more political freedoms relative to where they're leaving in the South in the 1940s and 50s, I borrow a strategy from the migration and economics literature. And this is a shift share approach, which basically approximates a natural experiment for determining outflows of migration. And to kind of illustrate how this process works, I'm going to show you kind of two panels from Jacob Lawrence's Migration series, a series of paintings about the Great Migration. And the painting here on the left, which is of the boll weevil, a pest eating the cotton plant, is representative of the shifts. I am able to leverage exogenous differences in the economy of counties where people are leaving from to as if randomly predict when people are going to leave one destination or another. And then I interact this with the shares, which are represented by this painting of migrants at a train station, choosing to board trains for Chicago, New York, or St. Louis. And what I'm going to use is kind of prior patterns of migration to make a prediction about where people are leaving to when they are departing the South. So to give you an illustration of how this works with two counties. So I take the universe of counties in the US South in 1940, 1950, and 1960, and I am able to basically use a simple machine learning model to predict outflows of Black migrants from each county in each decade. And I use a number of kind of agricultural and kind of fixed characteristics of these counties in 1940 to make these predictions. So to give you an example from two neighboring counties, Rapides Parish and Louisiana, I predict we'll have 8,000 departures between 1940 and 1950. Jefferson County, Mississippi, a neighboring county, is, I predict, going to have 4,000 departures. And so these are the shifts in the shift share. And then I interact them with shares that I construct from the 1940 full count census, which asks people who are living in cities in the North in 1940, what county they lived in 1935. And so I use the kind of matrix of county-city pairs to determine that if 5% of people who left Jefferson County, Mississippi between 1935 and 1940 end up in Chicago, that is my best guess for where people who leave after 1940 are also going to go. And so I assign, of the 4,000 departures from Jefferson County, 5% to Chicago, totaling 200 arrivals, less than 1% go to Los Angeles, 0 arrivals. Rapides Parish, which is not far away, but on a different rail line, sees far more people go to Los Angeles than Chicago. And as a result, I assign 5% of the 8,000 departures there to Los Angeles and less than 1% to Chicago. And so I sum this up for each city-county pair in my data set to get a total number of Chicago arrivals from each county in the South in each decade. And so the Treven variable that I'm going to be looking at here is basically a city-level predicted Black population growth between 1940 and 70. So the total number of predicted arrivals in each city between 1940 and 1970 simply divided by the Black population, or the total population in 1940 in those cities. And I'm just going to show you results using this kind of predicted level of Black migration to cities. I also have some results that I'll show you just looking simply at the endogenous Black population growth. And this shift share approach was actually developed initially as a kind of instrumental variables technique to use this kind of predicted level of migration as an instrument for actual migration. And if you're interested in that, the kind of synthetic migration, the predicted level that I'm constructing, is a strong predictor of actual Black population growth in these cities. Okay, so this is kind of the right-hand side of the equation here. And the estimate the estimation procedure I'm going to use is to estimate the causal effect of growth in Black population share on exclusionary zoning is a simple OLS regression of that share of multifamily housing that's allowed in cities on the predicted levels of Black population growth. And I'm going to control for, in some specifications, a matrix of basically pre-treatment covariates. So the most important one of these is my best guess of what the zoning looked like in 1940 to kind of control for changes and differences between cities that had already arisen by 1940. And since I'm not able to collect the zoning maps for all the cities like Chicago that I showed you, I use kind of a good proxy of this, which is the share of single-family homes in the city in 1940. And so I'm going to show you some reduced form cross-sectional estimates from this estimation procedure in the next slide. So I'm going to show you a plot of regression coefficients where I'm showing the effect of a 1 percentage point increase in Black population growth on the proportion of land that allows multifamily housing. And so if we would expect that increases in racial diversity lead to more exclusionary zoning, we would see kind of a negative coefficient here. And so I find that a 1 percentage point increase in Black population growth between 1940 and 1970 results in nearly 1 percentage point less land zoned for multifamily housing today. And these results are robust to a number of different procedures. We can include covariates, things like the employment to population ratio in 1940 to control for kind of economic draws that would have brought people to industrially thriving cities. Similar with the percentage of manufacturing, we can control for the percentage of immigrants in the cities to think about competition for kind of housing among people who lived in urban areas and urban slums in those times. It's also robust to dropping kind of high leverage shifts. So these would be kind of counties that are sending a ton of people at different times. So, we have Harris County in Texas, which is a big sender of people to Los Angeles and San Francisco. If we drop these kind of high leverage shifters, we see similar results, as well as dropping high or low quantile cities. We might be worried that this is driven by New York City, which has very low levels of exclusionary zoning at the expense of all the other central cities in the sample. We can also include, kind of state fixed effects if we think there's things related to state laws that are constraining cities' zoning powers. And finally, as I kind of talked about earlier, we can look at the kind of endogenous estimate, the OLS coefficient on actual Black population growth, setting aside kind of all this fancy shift share stuff, and using the predicted levels of Black population growth as an instrument for actual Black population growth. Now, hopefully I've convinced you that there's this relationship, probably causal, between Black population growth and exclusionary zoning today. But I want to present next a kind of placebo test. It may just be that there's this large wave of kind of poor people coming into cities, overcrowding slums, and that people are reacting to this, not because of the race of the migrants, but just because it's leading to urban problems, it's stressing city services, things like that. And so I've developed a placebo test of this, which is to look at white migrants from the South. These are people who are coming from the same counties in the South to the same cities in the North, leaving for similar economic reasons due to the collapse of some of the agricultural economy in the South and the draws of the industrial economy of the North. And this other great migration of Southern whites has these kind of similar push factors. So the shifts are going to be very similar, but they're likely to go to slightly different places. The 1935 to 1940 patterns of migration are different than they are for Black Americans. They're more likely to settle in non-union states and in more rural areas. And if exclusionary zoning was motivated by economic exclusion or overpopulation and overcrowding, we would expect to see similar effects of white migration on exclusionary zoning that we see from Black migration. And if I just use kind of the same procedure that I outlined, the construction of the shift share instrument, to look at white Southern population growth on exclusionary zoning, I basically find a null effect. It's a kind of positive coefficient, so the opposite direction that we would expect, but it is not significant. So hopefully this placebo test has kind of convinced you that there's something about the identities of these Black migrants that is driving this backlash and this policy change. And so the mechanism that I'm going to point to through which this happens is the mechanism of shifts in white attitudes towards policies relating to race. So I've shown you that Black population growth leads cities to zone less land for multifamily housing, that white Southern population growth has no effect on zoning, and that this suggests that the race of the migrants may play a role. And so the mechanism by which I argue this happens is through responsiveness to white racial attitudes. And so to test this, I look at whether white residents were indeed exposed to the Black migrants who are coming into their cities. It could be that given the already kind of segregated nature of cities, that they really didn't come into contact with the people who were migrating in. So I'm first going to test for whether or not the white residents in these cities were exposed and actually realized that there was an increase in racial diversity, whether they were basically receiving the treatment. And then the second is to test whether white residents' attitudes on race and policy are different in places with higher or lower levels of Black migration. So this kind of first step, what I call basically a manipulation check, is whether whites experienced contact with the Black migrants who are coming into their cities. And so I use a series of questions asked in the American National Election Survey in 1964, 68, and 70. And these items ask basically the composition of the people that the respondent encounters in their workplace, when out shopping, in their neighborhood, or at their local schools. And they're able to choose kind of all white, a mix of white and Black, or all Black. And so I'm going to show the effect, again, of this 1 percentage point increase in Black population on these perceived measures of integration and contact. And I'm going to show each of these 4 items on their own, and then I'm going to kind of just combine them into an additive index and show the kind of overall effect on contact. And what we see is that people who live in cities which saw a greater increase in Black population are more likely to report that the composition of the people that they're encountering at work or when they're out shopping in their neighborhoods and when they're dropping their kids off at their local schools are more diverse than people who live in cities that saw less Black migration. So it seems that at least these survey respondents who we're looking at are kind of getting the treatment. They're experiencing this increase in racial diversity. And so does this experience translate into shifts in attitudes? So I look at now policy questions related to race, as well as measures of kind of racial feelings and animus towards other groups. So these are a number of questions, all taken between 1956 and 1970. Questions like, is the pace of civil rights leaders too fast or too slow? Should the government see to fair treatment in jobs and housing? Feeling thermometers towards Black Americans. And again, I'm going to look at each of these items individually, but I also kind of combine them into an index of racial attitudes where a positive effect is a kind of the more racially conservative position that is having a lower feeling thermometer towards Blacks, saying that government should not be involved in ensuring fair treatment in housing and jobs, saying that the pace of civil rights leaders is too fast and that they should slow down. And what I find, again, looking at this effect of a 1 percentage point increase in Black population growth on whites' racial attitudes, is that whites in areas that became more diverse are more racially conservative than areas that experienced less Black population growth. This is true kind of this index of racial attitudes and of all of these individual items on their own. Now, the last piece I'm going to speak about is how these attitudes, which were more conservative in places that experienced more Black population growth, translated to these changes in policy, to the implementation of more exclusionary zoning. And here I kind of rely on some archival evidence through newspaper clippings in towns between 1940 and 1970 in this time period that we're looking at. And so the first thing that I point to is that concerned residents turn out to city council meetings and participate in the local public comment process to express their dissatisfaction with the construction of new multifamily housing and the residents who live in them. So these are some examples. One is actually from Chapel Hill in 1966. You also see similar things in New Jersey in 1959, where you see an avalanche of protests recorded against zoning plans that would allow multifamily housing. And while maybe not many people participated in these meetings or these protests, the most engaged individuals gathered petitions and organized their neighborhoods to prove to politicians that there was kind of a large majority support for restricting zoning to restrict the ability of Black low-income people to move in. So we can see clippings of zoning petitions and, again, New Jersey, signaling to politicians that there's wide support for these policies. And as they kind of professionalize, they organize civic associations that are durable and that are able to fight in multiple venues and over time. And they hire legal counsel. We see this in Kansas City, where the Organized Homeowners Protective Association hired a lawyer to delve into the legal phases and fight proposed zoning encroachments in their area. And finally, they, from these civic associations and organized groups, ran candidates for office. John C. Richardson, who runs for city council in Orangetown, New York, has trumpets that he's fought the downzoning in Orangetown for over 8 years. Now he wants the opportunity to fight apartments as your councilman to prevent the destruction of our residential neighborhoods. And I think this quote from the Wilmington, Delaware Morning News kind of sums up the evolution of this kind of sporadic protest politics into a kind of cornerstone of how local governments hear from residents today really well. They say, eventually, the role of civic associations and zoning is gradually changing from noisy opposition out in the open after rezoning requests are made to quiet, behind-the-scenes consultation at an earlier stage. These people in these groups are kind of brought into the local political process and have a seat at the table as a result. And I think this really helps explain a lot of zoning politics today. The argument that I'm making today that the origins and effects of exclusionary zoning are explicitly reflect racial conflict is increasingly a accepted view in liberal cities across the country. When the Cambridge City Council in 2020 was starting a process of rezoning their entire city to allow for multifamily housing everywhere, they declared that single-family only zoning is an unnecessary artifact of historically exclusionary housing practices. This was in 2020. The rezoning process in Cambridge has still yet to produce a legislative change. And that points to the difficulty and the stickiness of a lot of these laws. And we see that liberal cities across the country are very slow to remove these exclusionary barriers. And I think the answer that I kind of point to as to why these barriers are so difficult to remove is that there's kind of this combination of the exclusionary motives of voters, which certainly still exist, but are not as strong or as prevalent as they were in 1950, say. But it also created a politics of risk-averse politicians who fear retribution from voters for building too much, but not too little, and a shift of policymaking into institutions that promote a lot of local participation of incumbents who have benefited from the status quo. And this kind of bridges, I think, this earlier period when a lot of this politics is driven by race to the one that kind of economists and the existing explanations are more familiar with, where people are working to preserve the status quo and act in their kind of own self-interest. And so a lot of my other work really kind of delves into the process and the institutions that bring people in to local government to help make policies on these areas, the inequalities that exist and who participates, whether or not these institutions are responsive and actually take the considerations of people participating into account when forming policies, and the effects that this has on kind of social and economic equality. So I'll leave it there, but really looking forward to your questions, and thanks for the attention.
So it was interesting to put in the white Southerner outmigration too, but could you do the same thing with change in foreign born?
Yeah. So I know that there's kind of a similar approach using kind of the shift share approach to predicting foreign-born migration into the United States. I haven't looked at that, but I've just looked at kind of the endogenous growth in foreign-born population. I think around the time of the first Great Migration, and I don't really find any differences there. I think the era of mass migration from Europe in particular was an era when de jure segregation was still very much active, and so I think a lot of the kind of need to use these policies just simply didn't exist. Landlords could just discriminate and say no Italians or no Poles can live here. So, but yeah, no, I think thinking about other outgroups that could trigger similar responses is a really interesting question. And you kind of see restrictions in Europe today, for instance, on public housing and on low-income housing in places that have had more North African and Middle Eastern migration. I think people have shown this in Germany and Greece. So I think that the kind of core concept would travel, but it needs to have the zoning kind of policy be the logical policy response, which simply kind of I don't think was the case in the early 20th century.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, I really enjoyed the talk. Could you talk a little bit more about the shift share measures, in particular the exogenous measures of the exogenous shocks that would shift the population? Because I think the identifying assumption is that those shocks are not correlated with the pattern of migration in 1940. So in other words, the original pattern of migration, of course, is not random, since people are going to be going to cities that are growing more, actually maybe more receptive to Black migrants from the South. And so you have to assume that whatever shocks you have in data pushing people out of the South at those times are uncorrelated with the original population movements. But just maybe unpack, machine language is great, but we don't get a sense to see what's actually going on there.
Yeah, no. That's a great question. So if I can get this back. So this is just kind of the basically table with the lasso coefficients of all of the shift factors that the kind of model can choose in each decade between 1940 and 50, 50, 60, 70, 80, or 60, 70, sorry. And so most of them really have to do with kind of fixed geographic characteristics, so kind of the number of rivers, the soil permeability, things like that. There are some, kind of measures of the agricultural economy, so the land and the acres under farming, the total civilian labor force, things like that. And so this is kind of what goes into the model. And there are some things here that are actually post-1940, which are only used to predict the later decades. But to kind of get back to your point about what the identifying assumption is, it's yes, that these factors are kind of uncorrelated with the prior patterns of migration. And so the randomness comes from the shifts, not from the shares, which are obviously endogenous to previous waves of migration. And so I think you would have to expect that there are factors of the receiving cities that correlate with these characteristics of the counties in a systematic way, where, you know, the places that send more people to Chicago, the counties happen to have, you know, greater or less agricultural suitability. So I think like the assumption basically is that these factors are independent of the characteristics of the receiving cities, which, you know, I don't have a great way to validate, but seems like a reasonable assumption.
Well, you mentioned the boll weevil, like, so something that would be hitting different places geographically at different times. Would that be like a shock? Because if these things are stable characteristics, that wouldn't drive a shift necessarily. We're thinking of something that temporally and geographically vary.
Yeah. So I think the degree to which there's outmigration is kind of the interaction of a shock like the boll weevil with the reliance of the county on cotton cultivation, for instance. So I think certainly you know, I'm not relying on the kind of specific shocks and modeling that. It's just basically the prediction of the outmigration from these factors.
It's sort of following up on this table,
Yes.
which is really interesting. I enjoyed the talk. But there were also other political things going on that led to these outmigrations. So what is the consequence of excluding those known factors from your prediction equation for this movement?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. So I think, you know, we would have to think about there being kind of systematic variation in the political conditions, either at the state or the county level.
But there were. I mean, those
yeah.
have been demonstrated, right? There's been articles written about lynchings and things like
Mhm.
that as push factors.
Right. So I guess my concern about using those is that they are probably less random than some of these economic factors. I think, you know, I like why certain states have more or less kind of punitive regimes of white supremacy is like obviously a consequence of the political history of those places and their proximity to, let's say, different states in the North. So I think it's an interesting idea, and one actually I should look into and like see the degree to which these agricultural and economic factors correlate with kind of our political measures of you know, the behavior of politicians, let's say, in these states. But yeah, I kind of just first glance, I would worry that they would be far less as if random than other factors.
Yeah.
Yeah, great talk. I was kind of curious about two things. One, I looked on the like measure of exclusionary zoning that, you know, New York City is a huge outlier in having much more multifamily housing. And I'm kind of curious about these like outliers in general. Like if there are sort of northern cities that received a lot of Black immigrants and sort of had lower levels of exclusionary zoning and sort of what the political processes were in those cities. And then kind of related to that, thinking about white flight combined with a lot of in-migration where you have these like inner cities that, you know, in theory could have high enough levels of Black and other minority populations to sort of make changes to these policies.
Mhm.
Wondering about the political, how they were maybe like excluded or maybe sometimes included in these like decision-making processes of zoning and housing policy.
Yeah, thanks. So yeah, I'll start with the second. So obviously in kind of a lot of these big cities, particularly in the Midwest, the Black population becomes sizable enough that they are often kind of the dominant political coalition. And so What you see is like by the 70s and 80s, you're seeing certainly Black city councilors being elected, but often Black mayors. There's a whole set of papers written on this, but I think like the one that's kind of most pertinent to the politics of zoning is that this observation that they often came to power by allying with the kind of business community and taking kind of a more conservative political approach, like in the context of the Democratic Party dominance of a lot of these cities. And as a result, Black politicians, and I've seen this kind of in some of the archival work that I've done, are very against these kind of downzoning policies. And they actually make the explicit argument that this is kind of like a pulling up the ladder where, Irish, Polish, Italian communities that have kind of risen into the middle class, they all of a sudden now are kind of reducing the ability of, the Black lower class to have the same opportunities that they did by reducing the availability of multifamily housing stock. So, I think Black political power certainly factors into this, but I think by the time they are the kind of dominant political force, a lot of the changes have already happened, and a lot of politicians are, very kind of wary after seeing white flight, the decimation of their tax bases, things like this, of failing to respond to the small middle class of white residents who are left, and so they might be kind of unduly responsive to those voters. And then your first question was about the kind of outliers and places that have kind of high levels of multifamily housing. And obviously kind of New York is unique in some respects, but I think as you get to kind of like the outer borough neighborhoods in places like Queens and Staten Island, you start to see a little bit more of the same politics that you do in all of these other cities. And so, kind of even as late as the 2000s, there's still kind of downzonings going on in neighborhoods in kind of outer Queens in an effort to basically restrict apartment development and, by this time, kind of more economic than racial integration. But, there's one way to think about the results I showed you is like thinking of a New York versus a hypothetical New York had there been no Black population growth. And, I think my contention, like supported by the results, is that you would see kind of these outlying areas would be kind of more friendly to apartments had there not been the kind of large shock to racial diversity in the 50s, 60s, 70s that they experienced.
I have a question. I hope I'm not jumping over anybody on.
Please.
It's in person. This is Elizabeth. Hi. I'm really curious about whether you have kind of explored kind of the almost like the material economic foundations of white attitudes, right? So like, for instance, we know that property values hinge and the ways that properties are valued hinge on the presence of multifamily housing in a lot of municipalities, in a lot of assessment districts. And so I'm curious about whether you've explored that dynamic, right? That white attitudes have there's like a material basis for them, right? There's maybe like a fear of decreasing property values, for instance, in white areas if there are more multifamily units that are built in those areas.
Yeah, no, that's a great a point. And I think one that like I can't disentangle super well with the survey data that I have. So there are some questions on here that kind of speak more directly to the material effects of integration, things like support for open housing, or the government should see to fairness and jobs and housing, versus things that are kind of more expressive or have to do with just general attitudes towards the outgroup, like the kind of feeling thermometer measures. And the data is just like I think a little too noisy to be able to distinguish between that. But I think like it's I would not doubt that there is a material underpinning of this opposition to integration. And I think, you know, an important thing to keep in mind is even if there's just a small proportion of people who have you know, racial animus and don't want to live in an integrated neighborhood, their valuation of their reduced valuation of an integrated neighborhood means that a perfectly race neutral buyer would also value it less just because they're simply their home value is not going to appreciate as much. So I think the kind of material underpinning is certainly there, but not something that I can like speak to directly.
If somebody else has their hand up, you should call on them. I'm wondering about urban renewal and where that fits into the story, because I'm sitting here thinking about the story. You start out and thinking in lots of the northeastern cities, you got three-deckers everywhere, right?
Yeah.
And where do they go? And some of them get destroyed. I mean, that multifamily housing existed.
Yeah.
And then it was destroyed. It must have been differentially destroyed. And I just wonder to what extent urban renewal is part of the story that you're telling here.
Yeah. So I have looked at the scroll, I swear, but I have looked at the relationship between Black population growth and urban renewal, both in the amount that was dispersed to individual cities and the amount, the proportion of land that was set aside for various types of use. Sorry. Doesn't work. So there's been some effort to kind of collect data on the funds that were dispersed through urban renewal. Basically, I find that there's no relationship between the amount that was dispersed and the amount that was approved by Congress for individual cities as it relates to Black population growth. We also see, you know, basically no relationship between the types of projects that were for which the demolished land was used. You know, maybe one thing that we could squint at is that places with more Black population growth were a little more likely to see highway investment and reuse of land rather than kind of residential uses or, you know, public facilities like hospitals, things like that. But that's all to say that, you know, I think that the kind of interaction of this kind of big population shock with the destruction of a lot of, you know, what were deemed to be urban slums, you know, kind of created an environment where you had people who were living in neighborhoods that were formerly, you know, kind of right next to a Black neighborhood or, you know, kind of more peripheral areas feeling more threat. Basically, as the kind of slum areas were demolished, people were looking for places to live and were starting to try to rent and buy in what had formerly been, you know, kind of white-only neighborhoods that were depopulating. And so, you know, you kind of see some of these like blockbusting dynamics where you see these kind of swift depopulation of white neighborhoods when there's kind of one Black family that kind of comes in and buys. And real estate agents kind of use this as a tool to get everyone else to sell at kind of a below market value price. And so, you know, I think like setting kind of the data aside, I think that places where more Black neighborhoods were destroyed, by definition, saw kind of more integration of the neighboring white neighborhoods and probably, I would guess, created kind of a more racially conservative white population in those areas.
A question about the temporality, because there was a huge time frame that your study covers, right? Your data 40 to 70, and then your outcome is today. And I think you justified that a little bit by talking about the stickiness of these like zoning maps, but also, like Barbara pointed out, a lot of things happened in the meantime, right? There's urban renewal, there's realization that we have a housing crisis. So a lot of places have been in the news for rewriting their zoning ordinances. Also, like the increasing role that developers play in creating multi-use housing compared to the government building the projects that are no longer being built right now as much. So I wonder if you can talk more about kind of like the lag, but also like the choices that you made about the design.
Yeah. Thanks. So yeah, obviously the kind of perfect design would be able to measure the kind of levels of exclusionary zoning in 1940 and 1970 and make that direct comparison. So, you know, kind of as you alluded to, I think a lot of the cake was kind of baked by basically 1970, 1980. And there kind of simply just isn't that much more land left to downzone. Like if you look at Chicago, it's basically apartments are allowed on arterials and in the loop, and that's about it. And so you know, anecdotally, we see that there's not much change between kind of 1980 and the 2000s. As to kind of the recognition of like housing crisis and efforts to kind of roll some of this back, I don't think many places have done that, again, anecdotally to a large degree. And if they did, it's, you know, kind of ongoing right now. You know, I think other kind of changes that could like confound this relationship that happened, you know, between 70 and 2020 would be kind of the actual demographic shifts in these cities. I mean, the Great Migration essentially ended in 1970, and in fact, in a lot of places you saw you know, the Black population in these cities decrease as people move back to the South. And there's also some, you know, kind of good work by economists looking at the Great Migration showing that the kind of fiscal capacities of cities changes pretty drastically as a result of the Great Migration. Places where Black people were moving for economic opportunity basically collapsed, not just because of deindustrialization, but also because of disinvestment in these cities, shrinking tax base, more spending being directed towards policing, as opposed to like education, for instance. So I think to kind of explain the result that I'm finding, you would have to have something that changed between 1970 and 2020 that correlates with this Black population growth that led cities to kind of downzone more. And I think, you know, it's certainly possible that there are kind of some stories there, but I think most of them have to do with the initial wave of Black migration and the kind of social and fiscal conditions that it created in those cities. So even if the effect like hadn't fully taken hold by 1970, I think there's kind of also a lag in the, you know, amount of time it took to change these city zoning policies, even if all the migration, let's say, happened between 65 and 70. So hope that answers.
All right, we're a little over time, so thank you very much.